Greetings from Wheaton College. I'm sorry that I can't be with you all for the weekend, but at least we can do this electronically, and so I can be with you virtually. And maybe someday I can get out to Kansas City and enjoy the fellowship with all of you. I've been asked to talk on a couple of occasions, a PowerPoint lesson kind of teaching time, and then also a sermon. So we're going to begin with the teaching time, and you should have in your hands, or at least accessible, an outline that I sent. And this will actually give you what I'm going to be talking about, and you would be able to follow. But what it also can do, it also gives you all the Bible verses. So I'm going to allude to a few and talk about a few passages, but I won't be turning to them. But you will have that on that handout. So let me tell you how we're going to organize this. The topic for our time right now is the Bible and immigration. And what I'd like to do is think about some biblical foundations for how we think about this as Christians. So often when I talk to people, they give me all kinds of reasons or perspectives on immigration, like economics or the school system or the healthcare system or national security or things like that, all of which are important. But as Christians, we should ground our point of view in the scriptures, and that's what we're going to try to do tonight. So what I'd like to do is to begin with just a very basic idea that may be surprising to many of you, and that is that migration is a metaphor for the Christian faith itself. If you were to turn to 1 Peter chapter 1 and chapter 2, you would see that all of us as Christians are called strangers, and we're called sojourners, wanderers. And what we begin to see is that being an immigrant, or being a Christian, is being compared to being an immigrant. Now, how does that work? Well, we have a different king, we have a different citizenship, we have a different set of values. We are supposed to be strangers in a strange land. Now, if we think about it a little bit, what that might be able to indicate to us is the importance of migration and immigration in the Bible itself. It is such an important phenomenon in the scriptures that it is taken as a metaphor for what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. So as we think about what that might mean, what I'd like to do is give just a 30,000-foot panorama of what the Bible has to say. And we'll be looking at both the New and the Old Testament. And what we're going to see is that there's a breadth of material that covers from Genesis all the way to the book of Revelation. Things that are relevant towards migration today, even as it was in the ancient world. Now, as we begin this kind of conversation, we have to ask ourselves, where do we start? And so often in our political environment, when people begin to talk about immigration, they begin to talk about it from legal status. Do you have papers? Do you not have papers? How did you get in? When are you leaving? All these kinds of legal questions. And those are good questions, and we have to get to them, and we'll address them as we can. But what I'd like to do is actually go to the very beginning of the scripture itself. A lot of times when people talk about the legal piece, the passage that comes to everyone's mind is Romans 13. But Romans 13, at least in my Bible, is at about page 1,000. So what do we do with all those thousands or hundreds of pages before we get to the book of Romans? Because that will set the stage for how to read that passage in Romans 13. And what I would suggest to you is that the place to begin the discussion is on the very first page of the Bible itself, Genesis chapter 1. And what Genesis chapter 1 tells us is that every human being is created in the image of God. Every human being. No matter your legal status, no matter your country of origin, no matter your race, ethnicity, the language you speak, the background you come from, everybody in the world, including immigrants, is made in the image of God. Now, what does that mean? Well, for some people, that means we have certain capabilities. We have a mind, we have emotions, we have a will, we have a soul. All those are true. But when you get into the book of Genesis, and specifically chapter 1, what it talks about when it describes the image of God, it says that we are created to rule and to subdue the earth. Genesis 1, verses 26 to 28. Now we're not only talking about human worth in terms of what we have and what we can do. Now we're talking about human potential. These are the things that human beings can do. That is, we can rule and subdue the earth. We can partner with God in organizing the creation and work with him in obedience. And it's a privilege because in the ancient world, the image of God was normally associated with royalty. Only the king would be a person in the image of God. But in the Bible, every human being, it democratizes, we could say, the image of God concept. It gives us worth and potential. Now you can see the implications for this rather quickly. If we were to talk about the recent rulings in Dhaka, which talks about that whole legal arrangement that was organized by President Obama, the idea of letting young people who came with their parents undocumented be able to stay, at least for a time. These are renewable permits, legal status. But it was recently dealt with in the Supreme Court under the present administration. But if we think about not only the worth of these young people, but all of their potential, now we can begin to see how they can contribute to the national good. Now when you begin to talk about human worth and human potential, you begin to change the whole tenor, the whole environment, the whole way of approaching the discussion of immigration. How do we facilitate? How do we facilitate the use and the flourishing of all this potential for the national good? This will change how we look at law. This will change how we look at relationships and how we look at all the various dimensions of our society once we begin at this biblical starting point on page 1. And once we get into the Old Testament, we begin to see that from the very opening chapters of Genesis, we have stories of migration. And on your page, you'll see that I've listed several. And let me just highlight some that you might know. We're going to get back to Abram in the sermon, but let me just highlight something for you that's very interesting. When he leaves with his family in Ur, the Chaldees would have been the area of ancient Babylon, goes up to Haran, which would be on the Syrian-Turkish border today, and then comes down into Canaan. He receives a blessing and a promise that we'll get to in the sermon. But once he receives that, the first thing he does is build an altar, which is a wonderful testimony publicly of his faith in God. And they move into the land, but quickly there's a famine. And what we see in chapter 12 is that once the famine hits, he takes his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot and the belongings that he has, and they begin to move to Egypt looking for food. What we see is something that we find all over the world today. People in desperate need moving to another place to survive. And you know how the story goes. When they get close to the border, we know actually from archaeology, there was a series of forts on the eastern frontier of Egypt. Because of the Nile, they always had water, and so they had crops and food. And so they're always dealing with people coming in during times of famine. And so they had these forts on their eastern frontier. And it was probably as Abram and his wife Sarai are approaching one of these checkpoints that he says to Sarai, "Look, if they ask you, tell them that you're my wife, you're my sister, not my wife." Now what we see is even the father of the faith, Abram, willing to lie to get across a border to survive. We see his wife, Sarai, willing actually to put her body literally at risk so that everyone can eat. The only alternative is to go back into the desert and die. If we thought of the Abram story as the story of migrants, we could talk about Joseph. Joseph, who was sold into servitude by his brothers from the Canaan area. He goes into Egypt and he interprets dreams, as you know how the story goes. He comes out. He comes out, is given a new name, an Egyptian name. He's been able to interpret the dream of the Pharaoh, and out of thankfulness, he is exalted to the second position of the great country of Egypt. New name, new wife, an Egyptian wife. All kinds of social status and privilege. He is integrated. He obviously at this point can speak Egyptian. But when he has two sons by this Egyptian woman, he gives them Israelite names. When his brothers come, he understands their language. He hasn't forgotten his mother tongue. He uses an interpreter, but he knows what they're saying. And he goes behind the curtain and he weeps because he recognizes his brothers, even if they do not recognize him. What you begin to see is that here is this man many years in Egypt, fully assimilated, but yet with his heart still locked into his culture. And when he dies, he tells his family and the Egyptians that he wants to go back home to be buried in Canaan. Home was still somewhere else. Joseph is an immigrant story. We could talk about all these kinds of immigrants that are incorporated into ancient Israel. We could talk about Rahab and Caleb and Uriah, the Hittite, Ebed-Melech in the book of Jeremiah, a Cushite who saves Jeremiah from betrayal and death. We could talk about Naomi and Ruth. Naomi, who leaves with her family, her husband and 2 sons, in time of famine. They leave Bethlehem and they go across the Dead Sea and across the River Jordan to Moab. And there the 2 sons marry Moabite women. That is, the Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, marry immigrants. But as you know how the story goes, what happens is both sons die, as does the husband of Naomi. And she says, I just want to go home. I think times are better now. And she tries to talk her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab, and one of them does, Orpah. But Ruth goes back with Naomi to Bethlehem. And what you find in the book of Ruth is the story of an immigrant woman, a peasant woman, trying so hard to be assimilated, so hard to be integrated. At the end of the story, she marries Boaz. And when you get to the end of the book of Ruth, what you find is the genealogy of David. She is, in some ways, the foremother of David. This peasant woman from another country, an immigrant, becomes a key link in the genealogy that will eventually take us to Jesus himself. We could talk about so many other immigrant stories, the book of Daniel. Daniel and his friends forcefully taken away to Babylon. And from that distance, they hear about their country being destroyed. They probably lost all their family and all their friends. They were well groomed, well educated from good families. But now they're being trained to serve the empire that had destroyed everything they knew and had taken away everything they had. And now they were being forced to serve the empire. And what we see them doing is negotiating the only small space they had left over, which was their food. And food is a cultural marker. We all know that when we travel. We miss home cooking. We miss the kind of food that we're used to when we go to another country. Food is one of the ways we define who we are. And if you ever get to know people from another country, one of the first things they want to do is to share their food. And here we have Daniel and his friends negotiating that little space that they have left. They can't negotiate their names. They've been given new names. They can't negotiate the curriculum that they're being forced to take. They can't negotiate their position in service to the empire. The only thing they can keep is their food and their faith. These young immigrant men. And we could keep on going and talk about Ezekiel. We could talk about Esther. We can talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, who would be what we now call return immigrants, going back to their land, and all the tensions that they face when they go back, very much like we find today. Not only do we have stories of immigrants, we also have a whole host of laws for immigrants in ancient Israel. And this is unique in the ancient world. On the one hand, if we were to go into the Exodus story, we find laws being made to deal with foreigners. If you remember how Exodus chapter 1 goes, the Egyptians are afraid. They're afraid of the numbers of the Israelites. They're multiplying too fast, and they're afraid that they will actually rise up against the Egyptians. And so what they do is they put some strict laws into place to kill the young boys, even as they want the Israelites to keep working and to keep building Egyptian buildings. That's what we find so often, isn't it? Trying to put very kind of draconian laws into place, even as we need labor. And that's what we find in ancient Egypt. But when we come to Israel's laws, they recognize the need of immigrants And so they put a whole series of laws to provide for them, to provide food, proper rest. The Sabbath law will include the foreigner, to provide them just wages to be paid on time. Something that always happens is that immigrants are taken advantage of economically. And here we have in ancient Israel, even back then, recognizing they must be paid fairly and on time. They should have equal standing in the law system. That's another thing that frightens immigrants, is to move into a legal system you do not understand, maybe in a language that's foreign to you. And in ancient Israel, they were supposed to have the same penalty and privileges as the native born. We find even the most intimate part of ancient Israel, their worship was being opened up to the foreigners. And they're invited in to worship with ancient Israel. We all know that verse about loving your neighbor as yourself. We find it in the Gospels. That's probably where you may have seen it, but it actually goes back to Leviticus chapter 19. Can anything good come out of Leviticus? Yes. At least that one verse, chapter 19. But later on in that same chapter, where it says, love your neighbor as yourself, later on it will say, in verses 33 and 34 of Leviticus 19, love the foreigner as yourself. These are the hardest ones to love because they are so strange to us. When we ask ourselves, were there any expectations on the foreigner who would come in? Well, the answer would be yes. Obviously, they would have to learn the language of ancient Israel. And what we find too in Deuteronomy chapter 31, that they're supposed to be present at the periodic reading of the law. That makes sense too. If they want to become part of the society of ancient Israel, they would need to learn the laws. And so they too are required to be there present and to hear the law. And as we ask ourselves in the Old Testament, why does Israel even think it's important to do such things? Why do they need to take care of the foreigner? And the Old Testament gives them two primary reasons. The first reason is historical memory. Don't ever forget where you came from. Don't ever forget, it says over and over in Exodus and Deuteronomy, don't ever forget that once you were slaves, once you were foreigners in a foreign land, don't repeat what happened to you. And so many times in this country, what we have is historical amnesia. We have forgotten our own immigration or immigrant heritage. My father was the son of Irish immigrants. My mother was a Guatemalan immigrant. All of us would trace our backgrounds at some generational level to immigrants who came. And sometimes all we have in terms of historical memory are certain foods, certain things that we eat at Christmas, maybe certain things that we do at birthdays or things like that, certain songs we may sing. But this is not the kind of thing that Israel was supposed to remember. It was supposed to remember its servitude, its mistreatment, and the injustice that it endured. That is the historical memory that they were not to forget. And sadly, in this country, those are the very things that we have forgotten. And all we remember is some food and some drink from the ancient homeland. We have forgotten the Irish ghettos. We have forgotten the marginalization of the Italians, the mockery of those from Eastern Europe. What we did to the Chinese, our first major piece of immigration legislation in this country was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was in place until 1943. We forget all those bad stories. And now we accept the Irish. We have St. Patrick's Day. And we have these memories now. Oktoberfest, the Germans, that was the largest immigrant group into this country in the mid-19th century. We have forgotten all those things, of how hard it was for them when they came. Foreigners and those who are different is nothing new in the history of the Republic. I have an article written by Benjamin Franklin, and he's worried about the Germans in the colonies. He says they speak their own language, they have their own churches, they have their own schools, they have their own newspapers and their own stores, and he's wondering if they will be able to anglicize. And then he says, you know what, they're not the same pigmentation that we are. When I come, but for Benjamin Franklin, there was. And then you begin to see even an additional stereotype by Benjamin Franklin. He says, and the men beat their mothers. Where did he get that? But then he says, oh, they become civilized, you see. So even from the very founding of the Republic, we see prejudice, stereotypes, and how hard it is to assimilate and to integrate those from another land. The Old Testament's always aware of these kinds of things. These are very human things. I've traveled over the last couple of years to Argentina and in Guatemala. I've been in Australia and the UK and France, and the same tensions of massive inflows of foreigners and the wondering how to integrate them into their national life. All the prejudices, all the fears, these very human things the Old Testament law is very well aware of and tries to legislate against it. And one of the things that they have to do is remember that once that was their situation, and they should not ever forget that. But the second motivation is even more profound. The second motivation is that they are to love the foreigner because God does. Deuteronomy 10, verses 17 to 19. And when people say, why should we love the stranger? Why should we love the immigrant? My answer is because God does. I can't give you a better reason than that. And Deuteronomy chapter 10 says, he loves the immigrant, the foreigner, by giving them food and clothing. And he does that through his people. So there's the charge for us, no matter what we might think. If we are to reflect the heart of God, part of that is giving a helping hand to those from elsewhere. I could go on about the Old Testament, but let me move rather quickly to the New Testament. And we could begin with Jesus himself. He begins his life as a refugee, as you would know. He's born in a small village. Herod hears about this newborn king, and he sends soldiers to kill all the little boys of that little village. But Joseph gets wind of this before that happens, and he takes his little family, Mary and the baby Jesus, and they are refugees into Egypt. We're not quite sure how long they stayed, not very long, but eventually they made their way back. But Jesus begins his life as a refugee, seeking asylum in Egypt. If we were to look in the teachings of Jesus, he never talks about immigration or foreigners in that kind of way, but he's always dealing with outsiders, the Gentiles and women and the sick. He's dealing with sinners, people that others around him would reject. Jesus is always extending his hand to those who are different and those who are rejected. One of the most telling things that we find with Jesus is the parable of the Good Samaritan. If you remember how that goes in Luke chapter 10, one of the Pharisees comes up to him, teaches the law, and he says, what shall I do to gain eternal life? And Jesus gives him some things to do. And he says, I've done all those things. So you need to love your neighbors yourself. And then he says, well, who's my neighbor? And then Jesus begins to tell him a story of a Jew who'd been robbed on the way from Jerusalem to Jericho and left for dead. A couple of religious men walk by, and they don't stop. They don't want to be contaminated by a potentially dead body. But a Samaritan comes by, hated and despised by the Jews. There's history behind that. He takes this wounded Jew, takes him to an inn, pays all the things that need to be paid, and says, look, if there's anything else to be paid for, I'll pay it when I come back. And Jesus asks this man a very pointed question. Who was the neighbor in the story? And if you remember, that was the opening question. See? Who is the neighbor I'm supposed to love? And Jesus is asking him, so who was the neighbor to the man who was robbed? Well, the answer is the Samaritan. That was the neighbor that he was supposed to love. And this young man can't even say those words. But he says, the man who helped the other man. He could not even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. But there Jesus is teaching him to love your neighbors yourself. And your neighbor in this story is the most despised people who live right next to you. Powerful teaching of Jesus. We could talk about the church's early strategy. If you know the book of Acts, what Paul does is he goes around the Mediterranean basin to all these little communities and synagogues that were founded by the Jews. The dispersed Jews, or the diaspora they're called. And he begins by mobilizing a team that goes all over the Mediterranean basin. It's a ministry of migration, working with migrants who have now settled in new lands. That's how the early church begins. And his team is made from people from all over that area. Even the church's early strategy is based on migration. In fact, in Acts chapter 1, when the disciples received the promise of the Spirit, they are said they're going to be witnesses to him in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. You see, migration will be part of the calling of being a follower of Jesus. In fact, if you know the Great Commission in Matthew 28, that's it, isn't it? We are called to make disciples of all the nations. We are called as a church to migrate all over the world with the good news of Jesus Christ. We could talk about charitable hospitality. This actually is one of the requirements for being an elder in the early church, to being hospitable to those who are different and those who are from outside. This is not easy. In fact, if we go to the epistles, you find over and over again this tension between different groups in the early church. The idea of putting together people from different countries and different languages and different ethnicities was causing all kinds of problems in the early church. And what they hear is that in Jesus there is neither Greek nor Jew, slave nor free, male nor female. The differences are being brought down as we move together into one body of Jesus. And then, of course, we can talk about the Lord's Supper. Everyone is welcome. There is always food at the Lord's table. He invites all these people to come and to partake of his body and his blood. At the table, all are sinners, irregardless of where we come from and what language we speak and our backgrounds. Here at the church's celebration of the Lord's Supper is where we all become one. And all those differences that the outside world will highlight and underline and exploit to political advantage, and for prejudice and even racism, all those things now should come and be left upon the altar and removed in the celebration of the Lord's Supper. Now, I've given you just a broad sweep of what's going on in the Bible. I have a new book. It's called The Bible in Borders, Hearing God's Word on Immigration. Once again, The Bible in Borders, Hearing God's Word on Immigration. There you'll find all of this is explained with more detail and explained a lot better than here I am in a classroom at Wheaton College. But hopefully that will be a good resource for you. So where do we go from here? Well, I'm not sure what your Mennonite denomination will do, but yours is a history of migration, as you would know. And you have a history of learning about being different and moving into every part of the world with certain Mennonite characteristics and gifts. I'll give you one quick story. Years ago, I was in El Cono Sur, as we say in Spanish, the southern cone of Latin America. And that would include Chile, Argentina, as we would say in Spanish, and Paraguay in English. But years ago, there was, or there is still, a section of Paraguay called El Chaco, and El Chaco was inhospitable. And so the president of Paraguay said, you know, the people who can come and work this land and make it habitable are the Mennonites. And so he invited the Mennonites to go into El Chaco in Paraguay. And when I was there years ago, these were German Mennonites. And there they were, a whole German-speaking community in the middle of the southern cone of Latin America. This is your heritage as Mennonites. So I would hope that this will help orient you a little bit. The how-tos would depend on your local church, on your local communities and your schools and other kinds of things. But I would hope that at least now as you think about those things, as individuals, as families, as a church local and a church denominationally, I pray that this kind of biblical foundation will be a guide and somehow give you a better lens to see what God would want for us to do and say and be as Christians in the middle of a very complicated immigration reality in the United States and around the world in 2020. once again, thank you. I hope this was helpful, and we'll see you again, I guess, when I give you a sermon based on this kind of material as well. God's blessings on each and every one of you. Thank you.